Hi, thanks. While I do international relations, this is really, here I'm wearing my political theorist hat, and really even my moral philosopher's hat. So I'm not going to be talking really about IR, but I'm going to be rather talking about a debate, a problem that lies in the boundaries between economics and moral philosophy. If we don't destroy the world, a lot of people could live in the future. And a whole lot. And that means a whole lot of potential happiness and suffering, a whole lot of potential preferences satisfied or denied. In other words, it's the kind of thing that has traditionally mattered a whole lot to utilitarians. And you might think, in dealing with questions like catastrophic climate change, that economists, with their roots in the utilitarian tradition, would give these future events a whole lot of weight. But in fact, when the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, you might think that economists would give this a lot of weight, but in the case of the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, when it came out in 2006, a lot of economists actually pounced on it for recommending what they thought were too aggressive measures dealing with climate change. And the criticism was commonly made by economists. The problem was that Stern had rejected pure time preference, and or in one way or another had used too low of a discount rate. That is to say, it had given too much weight to things that go on in the future. Now, in criticizing Stern, the prominent economist William Nordhaus made an argument which has been repeatedly made in favor of discounting future costs and benefits. And he made this argument by giving a striking sort of example. Nordhaus asks us to imagine that a wrinkle, he says, would appear in the climate 200 years from now. And he asks us to imagine this wrinkle reducing economic output by a very small amount, but it would go on forever after, from 200 years in the future into the future. He's argued that with Stern's discount rate, in order to prevent this tiny little wrinkle that would prevent a fall of consumption from $130,000 a year to $129,870 a year per capita, we would be justified in sacrificing more than half of next year's consumption in order to do this. And he says this bizarre result arises because the value of the future consumption stream is so high with near zero time discounting that we would trade off a very large fraction of today's income to increase a far future income stream by a very tiny fraction. Now, Nordhaus takes this to be a reductio ad absurdum. If very low interest rates or discount rates lead to this sort of conclusion that it would be desirable to do this, there must be something wrong in this case, on this view, with the notion of having low discount rates. However, Nordhaus's contemporary colleague at Harvard, Martin Weitzman, has, as many of you will know, argued that we could be facing very serious losses in the future. Weitzman argues that on a basis, in an influential piece in 2009, on the basis of a survey of the literature, that we can't rule out extreme climate change. He claims that a mean global surface temperature change relative to pre-industrial revolution levels will in 2 centuries or so be greater than 10 degrees with a ballpark probability estimate of between somewhere around 5%, and will be greater than 20 degrees with a ballpark probability estimate of somewhere around 1%. If we don't give these sort of future consequences great weight because we discount them away, it seems like we're discounting away an awful lot of potential suffering in the future. So we seem to be faced with a dilemma. As Dale Jamieson says, there seems to be no plausible value for the pure rate of time preference with discounting. If the setting is zero or extremely low, the interests of the present are swamped by the future. If it is set high enough to protect the interests of present people, the interests of those who live in the further future lose virtually all significance. Now, what I'm going to be trying to do in the rest of this talk here is to propose a solution to this dilemma and for how we might come up with a plausible sort of method of discounting. What I think is important to recognize here is that the problem that we're confronting here, as already John Rawls pointed out some 40 years ago, is a classic general problem with utilitarianism. It's that if you give that under utilitarianism, if you count numbers, small benefits to very large numbers of people can potentially overwhelm very large losses to smaller numbers of people. And so with Nordhaus's Rendall example, he's raising what Derek Parfit referred to as a Rawls-Scanlon case, in which we can either save one person from some great burden or give many smaller benefits to many other people who are all much better off. Nordhaus is assuming that people in the future will be much richer, and he's suggesting that we are, in some sense, the small number of people who would have some great burden imposed upon us. And he argues that if we don't discount the future, then it could imply that we ought to make this great sacrifice in order to benefit vast numbers of well-off future people, even a little bit. That's because if the many are sufficiently numerous, then sacrificing the few could be the impartially optimal choice. Now, what I want to suggest here is that we have resources to deal with this problem in the work of another major contemporary philosopher, T.M. Scanlon, who has argued that in cases like this, when the difference between what the minority would lose and what the majority would gain is sufficiently great, the minority can justifiably reject the sacrifice, however many people stand to benefit. And I would suggest that intuition tells us this is true in Rendall. If you say to me, we should all next year sacrifice more than half of the world's income, you imagine the enormous suffering that would cause the world, in order to bring countless numbers of rich future people going on way into the future, a minor increase in income, I think we would all be rather justified in saying, screw you. It's just, this is an unreasonable sort of thing to demand of us. Now, some people will say, this is a sort of, in general, it's never justified to even impose burdens on great burdens on minorities of people in order to benefit large majorities who are better off. And this confronts the problem with this, though, is that it seems to be in conflict with actually some quite accepted practices in our society. So John Broom's well-known example of the NHS illustrates this. Our society routinely makes decisions to relieve the mild pain of very large numbers of people rather than curing the severe illnesses of the few. If we took all the money that the NHS spends on relieving moderate sorts of discomfort for millions of people every year, most of us have probably been into the NHS in the last few years with some minor complaint, and we plowed all that money into trying to find cures for rare, severe diseases and so forth, we could benefit some very badly off people greatly. But instead, the NHS doesn't prioritize these cases, give them absolute priority, and it routinely allows some people to die or their diseases not to be treated, even when they're severe, in order to spend some money on relieving the mild pain of many people. And to my mind, that's a justified sort of decision. So it doesn't seem as if it can be invariably unjustifiable to benefit the many at even the great expense of the few. Now, if aggregating all those benefits to large numbers of people is justified in a case like that, why wouldn't it be justified in a case like Rendall? Why shouldn't we say, if we can bring even small benefits to very large numbers of people in the future, that it would be justified to sacrifice us now? Now, here's where I'm going to make a rather daring philosophical move. I'm going to suggest, drawing on the late work of Derek Parfit, that there are two kinds of criteria that we can apply when we're making these sort of decisions about aggregating costs and benefits. Parfit, in his great last work on What Matters, distinguished between what he called Scanlonian and Kantian contractualism. Kantian contractualism, he argued, says that moral principles are acceptable when they are ones that everybody could rationally accept. Scanlon, on the other hand, famous criterion for moral principles is that they are ones that nobody could reasonably reject. Now, I want to suggest that in the case of the National Health Service, which I just discussed here, and in the case of Rendall, we could rationally accept a principle requiring us to benefit in the many because it maximizes impersonal value. If enough people stand to benefit from us benefiting the majority here, we could plausibly argue that in some impersonal sense is the best thing to do. And because we could all rationally accept this, I think it is morally acceptable for the NHS, for instance, to make these decisions and impose them upon the people who get left out and not benefited, harsh as that may sound. However, imagine if you were in the position of making the decision yourself and you were going to be the person who suffered. The NHS could either choose to treat 10 million people's headaches or treat your severe disease. Even if it maximized impersonal value, I think you could reasonably reject a principle requiring the NHS to do this because the cost would be so great to you. Now, what I'm proposing here is that Kantian contractualism and Scanlonian contractualism, as Parfit formulates them, govern different things. Kantian contractualism, that principles must be ones that everybody could rationally accept, govern what we can do to other people, whereas Scanlonian contractualism governs what we owe to others. So take the example, for instance, of famine relief. If taking away 80% of the income of most of the people in this room and redistributing it to starving people in Africa would make things go best overall, I think that the government could justifiably do that. It would make things go better in general, and we could all rationally accept that. However, if it were left up to us, if the question is, ought you to sacrifice 80% of your income to help people in starving countries because it will make things go best, it's also something to me, it seems to me that you, given it with your own free will, could reasonably reject. It would not be unreasonable for you to say, well, because I care more about myself, as most of us do, I tend to prioritize my own interests, even though it might be impartially best for me to do that, that seems to be too demanding on me. So what we can reasonably compel people to do, and what they are required to do of their own, I think there's a significant difference. Now, that to me explains then the difference between the case of the NHS, which I've discussed, and the case of Rendall. The NHS can justifiably impose sacrifices on minorities of people by not treating their severe diseases and rather relieving people's headaches. But on the other hand, the thing that seems so outrageous to me about the case of Rendall with Nordhaus is that Nordhaus is suggesting that we would be obliged to impose this enormous sacrifice upon ourselves in order to benefit people who would in any case be much better off than we are. And it does seem to me that we could reasonably reject that. Now, what I'm suggesting here then is that we can justifiably reject major sacrifices of our own accord in cases where the beneficiaries would be a lot better off than we are in any case. And unfortunately, the current sort of approach toward discounting doesn't take into account this nuance, that sacrifices may be justifiable when the people would be much better off than when we may be able to reject such sacrifices when the people would be much better off than we are, but not when they would be left worse off. And what I'm going to suggest in the last part of this lecture is the current approach toward the way we discount future costs and benefits reflects what philosophers call an ecological fallacy. This involves treating a statistic that describes a group in the aggregate as if the statistic described its individual members. So if you have a group of people, some of whom have an income of $10,000 and some of whom have an income of $50,000, and you concluded that the people in the group have incomes of $30,000, you would be committing an ecological fallacy. Just because the average income is $30,000 in a group doesn't mean that the individual's incomes in that group are of that much. Now, writing about discounting about 20 years ago, the economist Thomas Schelling argued that future people would be in the aggregate better off than we are. He pointed out, though, that some future people will be poorer than today's rich people. And so the arguments for discounting on the grounds that people in the future would be richer risk committing an ecological fallacy. If we do nothing for future people on the ground that they will on average be richer, then we're missing that important fact that there will be some people in poor countries who are still poorer than we are today. What I want to suggest here is that when we're dealing with questions like the possibility of catastrophic climate change, we also need to take into account different possible worlds. In most scenarios about the future people are going to be better off than we are. Probably climate change will not be so severe as to so impoverish the world that future people will be worse off, at least in an economic sense, than we are. However, there are a few scenarios, a few possible states of the world in which climate change is so bad that future people are worse off. If we fail to mitigate climate change because we average across scenarios, if we sort of say, on average, we believe future people will be better off than we are, then we're going to miss this important fact about the world. So what I'm suggesting here is that in thinking about climate change scenarios and other catastrophic risk sorts of scenarios, we need to try to disaggregate them into cases where people will be better off than we are and much better off, and cases where they won't be. And I think we can justifiably, as I argued earlier in the lecture, discount or really ignore costs and benefits to people who will in any case be much better off than we are. But that doesn't mean we can legitimately ignore costs and benefits to people who won't be much better off than we are. Now let's imagine that in 95 cases out of 100, climate change is not so bad that it leaves people in the future poorer than we are. And in fact, let's imagine that in 95% of the cases, those people will be much better off. I would argue we can defensively ignore costs and benefits in these scenarios for the reasons I've given. That giving ourselves pure time preference in a case where people will in any case be much better off than we are is morally defensible. And we could reasonably reject any principle requiring us to make sacrifices on behalf of these much better off people. However, let's say there are 5% of scenarios, or 5 chances in 100, where climate change is so bad that vast numbers of future people are worse off than we are. If, as many economists presently sort of suggest, we should just say, oh, future people will be richer than we are, and for that reason we discount away costs and benefits to them, we are going to be ignoring these sorts of contingencies. We cannot reasonably reject a principle requiring us to make sacrifices to help those people who would be much worse off than we are. So I want to, in concluding here, propose a method of discounting, which I think would be morally defensible. First of all, I want to suggest we should calculate the values of costs and benefits of policies dealing with climate change or for preventing other sorts of risks in each discrete growth scenario. When those benefits go to much better off people, we can permissibly ignore them entirely unless they're cost-free to provide. I don't think any of us morally needs to lie awake at night worrying about economic losses to people who will be a lot better off than we are anyway. However, so let's just strike those scenarios out of our cost-benefit analysis. On the other hand, I think what we should then do is weight costs and benefits within each remaining scenario. Some philosophers believe we can legitimately give some extra weight to our own interests, say is what Samuel Scheffler refers to as giving one's from personal point of view priority here. Maybe we think we can permissibly give some extra weight to our own interests. Maybe we don't. In any case, weight costs and benefits in any sort of way we think is permissible, but we don't ignore those. Now, then I would suggest we ought to assign subjective probabilities to each remaining scenario. If we think, for instance, that in 5% of scenarios, climate change could be so worse off, but so bad that future people would be worse off than we are, then in those 5%, those are the 5% of scenarios that we ought to take into account. And we have to multiply each remaining scenario's weighted value by the subjective probability that we assign to it. Now, if, for instance, there's a 95% chance that future people will be, even with climate change, a lot richer than we are, then I suggest we just then ignore those 95% of scenarios and give no weight to the costs and benefits in those cases. But we can't legitimately discount away the costs and benefits in the remaining 5% where people are worse off than we are. And because those costs and benefits will go on for so long into the future, if we mar the earth permanently in a way that leaves people impermanently impoverished, that would affect so many people, leads me to that conclusion here. Because of the vast numbers of people who may live in the future, this mandates really very great precaution with even low probability catastrophic risks. I'll stop there.